Welcome back to Advice for Grad Students. I'm your host, Phil Hahn, and with me today is a fellow grad student with me back in the day, Sameer Lalwani. Welcome to Advice for Grad Students.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and the advice we give today is our own and not that necessarily of our institutions. Today, Sameer is going to be talking about outside or non-traditional funding sources. So Sameer, over to you.
Great. Well, I will try to focus on the areas I know, which have a lot more to do with foundation funding, but also U.S. government funding. I think the foundation funding, I'll start with that. I think it's familiar to a lot of academics. The institutions like Carnegie Endowment, MacArthur Foundation, Packard Foundation, all these foundations sort of, have calls for academic research, but also academic programming, events, graduate students and sort of graduate student funding, book projects, things like that. I won't go into too much depth on it other than to say I think they're all valuable, but they're probably all, I have found over time, they are all shrinking to a degree. Who knows, maybe the effective altruism crowd is gonna really spark the funding stream. But I've found that over time, in my time over the last 8 years, looking at foundation funding, it's on the decline to a degree, or maybe there are just sort of more demands for it. Where I found it to be, there are sort of more research funding available that I didn't appreciate or understand when I first started at a think tank in Washington was funding from the U.S. government. So I have found that there's vast pools of funding from U.S. government sources for lots of research, both applied research and even some theoretical research. But there are sort of a few caveats and conditions to be aware of for this. So maybe the first that should be thought about is that this research pool is a little, I'm talking about this distinctly from NSF funding or Minerva grants, which I think are much more oriented towards pure academic research or academics in university settings who are looking to get funding from those pools of resources. But outside of that, there are a number of offices and departments that work particularly on international relations, national security, obviously the Pentagon, but also the Department of Energy and NNSA, Department of Homeland Security, the intelligence community. All these entities fund lots and lots of research. And the research, though, I think that to be appreciated is that it's not pure scientific inquiry, pure theoretical questions that require answers, gaps in the literature that need to be filled. But nor are they so narrow as to be advocacy or trying to sort of stack the deck with research findings that confirm things that they already know. I think that it's a space in between, which is that oftentimes what they're looking to do is answer questions that provide insights to mid-tier operators, warfighters, decision makers. So not the grand strategy questions at the apex of political decision making or policy decision making, nor is it just confirmation bias seeking behavior, but it's trying to answer maybe some operational questions. And because of that, it requires sort of scoping the answers, scoping the research design a little bit differently, scoping the proposal a little bit differently, but trying to address things that have maybe some more immediate utility or tractable utility for policymakers over the next 2 to 5 years. But within that, what I would say is that you can build larger questions either on top of or within that research agenda. So it's a little bit about sort of thinking what the consumer wants and then what you as the researcher wants. And you can find sort of, you can create the Venn diagram of what that overlap looks like. You have probably a useful proposal to pursue. There's another element of this which you have to consider, which is, I wouldn't say it's quite an insider game, but there are competitive advantages to knowing the research funders that you would be applying to and working with. There are oftentimes open invitations for application, these broad agency announcements that they're called. But even when they are broad agency announcements that are open to the public, they're on public domain websites, there oftentimes is a level of understanding of like what they're actually seeking and knowing the people within those entities that gives you as an applicant an advantage if you are familiar with the organization, the program, the division, what their objectives are, and what they mean within sort of this really sometimes legalistic, sometimes really jargony language in their broad agency announcements. So point being, you probably want to know the entity and the people within it and the people who have worked with them if you want to have a competitive shot at applying for one of these US government grants. And also, it also requires maybe building a little bit of trust between the sponsoring agency and the project directors and yourself. And that trust can get accrued through just familiarity with your work, through briefings that you do for the agency, independent of that application cycle, or maybe sort of, prior to the application cycle. The best way to do it is if, for example, that agency is funding research to another scholar or institution, and you help out that scholar or institution in their project pro bono, or participate in a workshop that they do or something like that, you'll probably get on their radar and then become familiar with how they work, and they in turn will become familiar with some of your work. So I think that relationship building obviously sort of helps a lot, in addition to a good research question that is tailored for policy operators and decision makers, but also has some theoretical import or empirical import for your interests in that project. There's another route to doing this, but I call it like a bank shot, which is that these government grants are often quite large, and they're often going to intermediary institutions like a think tank. Some of those think tanks are federally funded research and development centers. Some of those are US government adjacent, like National Defense University. And some of those are just independent 501c3 think tanks. The US government contracts with all of them and put large grants of funding for broad project direction. And within that, those institutions can then adjudicate if they want to fund projects in this sort of small 5-digit, sometimes 6-digit research projects to individual scholars or sort of universities, things like that. And so getting to familiar with those think tanks that are the intermediaries of this US government funding stream can also be pretty useful. So the secret to think tanks, I'd say, is that they oftentimes have pretty decent resourcing, but not enough content being produced, or there always is a demand for content to be produced. And the nice thing about academics is that they're good at generating content, maybe not in volume, but certainly in quality. And so there are natural symbiotic relationships to be developed between think tanks and academics. Again, it doesn't always have to be monetized. It can start out as sort of just a rate to build relational capital, but ultimately, if an academic has a good project proposal that they think fits within the scope of work of a think tank, and they have funding for it, and there's an opportunity to make a pitch, and you can make a pitch for, a big survey experiment or survey research project that you want to do that takes a lot of time to fund through an NSF cycle, where it's just fairly expensive to do survey research. And you might be able to make the case to a think tank that it's in their interest to fund it, especially if you can offer a value proposition to them. That can be, a report published under the moniker of that think tank. It can be a briefing to their board or some of their donor or government sort of funders. It can be a data repository that gets sort of owned by that think tank. You can come up with creative propositions here, but the point is that they have resources, and if you want those resources, you can sort of broker a deal that makes the most sense for both of them. Maybe the last thing sorry, Phil, you wanted to.
Well, I was with the time we have left, grad students want to know how, right? This all sounds great. Funding available for big projects.
Yeah.
How do you get from a grad student to being connected and getting to access to these resources?
Yeah, so I don't think there's a direct route, but I think it requires a general awareness that when you present work at academic conferences, especially, ISA, maybe APSA as well, when you are doing, giving a talk at a U.S. government, at a think tank in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere, there are often audience members who are coming from the U.S. government community that are interested in your work. There are a lot of people who are who've come from academia, decided to work in government, and are always on the lookout for good ideas, research, scholars, people that they can invest in. And you should take those meetings, those engagements. You should follow up with them when they give you their business cards. I've been surprised at the people who sort of show up at ISA conferences who come from the U.S. government and are willing to, who actually invite you to come give talks at U.S. government agencies. So I think, sort of be open to those engagements, and there may not be a monetary payoff or immediate payoff for your CV in that moment, but if you can think sort of broadly and downstream, most often than not, good things will come from those engagements. If you want to be more proactive about it, then it requires obviously being more visible and attending things in Washington, D.C., maybe engaging more think tanks, offering to be a non-resident fellow, and publishing under their brand or their name. And it doesn't mean you have to publish in a think tank's publication, but identifying your affiliations with that think tank. Oftentimes that's an interest of theirs to have their brand be distributed sort of in wider spaces. And in doing so, you build some currency with that institution that will then allow for you to ask for support, or at least sort of get an audience for a conversation about research funding in the future. So I think that's the starting point, and you can build from there.
All right. Well, Sameer, that's about all the time we have today. I think that's some great advice. As grad students, you're in a profession already. You're starting to build it. So building up the networks and the knowledge of the different organizations and the funding. If you want to get something done, you're going to have to figure out funding along the way. You might as well put that and begin to develop those tool sets that Sameer is talking about. So anyway, Sameer, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to talk to us about non-traditional sources of funding.
You bet. Anytime.